The morning light barely touched the ruins of the old city. It seeped through collapsed concrete and twisted metal in thin, golden slivers, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits. And in the middle of it all, Ren knelt in the only place that still felt alive. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of scraping by, moved with a gentleness that seemed almost sacred. He carefully pinched away a withered leaf from a tomato plant growing out of an old ceramic pot, his touch light, forgiving. Around him, a hidden rooftop garden flourished in defiance of the monster-infested wasteland below. Cabbage heads grew fat in repurposed wash basins. Herbs spilled from old boots. It wasn't much, but to Ren, it was everything. He sat back on his heels and let out a slow breath, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. His clothes were patched in 3 places. His boots had a hole near the sole. But his eyes held a warmth that no amount of hardship had managed to extinguish. A soft meow drew his attention. A scruffy stray cat, its fur matted and one ear torn from some long-ago fight, rubbed against his leg. Ren smiled, a rare, genuine thing. "Hey, little guardian," he whispered, reaching down to scratch behind its good ear. "Almost done here. Just need to collect the water and then—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The cat had heard it all before. The plan, the hope, the name that made his voice soften. Sera. Ren stood and moved to the edge of the rooftop, where he'd rigged an intricate system of tarps and gutters to channel rainwater into a series of cleaned chemical barrels. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, just like him. He was a low-rank hunter, the kind that guilds wouldn't even look at twice, but he was resourceful, and he was loyal, especially to her. His partner, his love, the one person in this broken world who actually saw him. As he reached for the first barrel, something in the debris at his feet caught the light. A faint, pulsing glimmer like a heartbeat made visible. He frowned, kneeling down, brushing away the dust and rubble. There, half buried in the concrete, was a shard of metal, no bigger than his palm. It was ancient, covered in symbols he couldn't read, and it glowed with a soft, internal light that seemed to breathe. Ren's heart quickened. He'd been a hunter long enough to recognize when something was valuable. And this was beyond anything he'd ever seen. He glanced around, instinct telling him to hide it. He slipped the shard into his pocket, feeling its warmth seep through the fabric and settle against his skin. A good luck charm, he told himself, for the meeting. He carefully harvested the ripest vegetables, arranged them in a worn but clean cloth, and tied it all into a bundle. This was for her. A meal. A symbol, proof that even a nobody like him could provide, could build something. The trek to their meeting spot was familiar, worn into his bones by 100 hopeful journeys. It was an old observation deck, one of the few places in the ruins that still offered a clear view of the upper city, the gleaming spires of the wealthy districts, the floating transit line, the world that existed above the filth and the monster, the world Sera belonged to. He arrived early, as he always did. He set out the food on a low wall, arranging it like an offering. He sat and he waited. The sun climbed higher. The stray cat who had followed him curled up at his feet. And then he heard it, the crunch of boots on gravel, multiple sets, moving with precision, with purpose. Ren's smile returned, wider this time. She'd brought friends. She was proud of him. She wanted to share this moment. He stood, turning to greet her. The smile froze on his face. Sera walked at the head of a squad of hunters, their uniforms crisp and blue, the colors of azure sky, one of the most powerful guilds in the city. Their weapons were drawn, their eyes were cold, and Sera, his Sera, pointed her blade directly at his heart. Her lips curved into a smirk he'd never seen before. It was cruel, dismissive, as if he were garbage clinging to her shoe. "Ren of the Outer Ruins," she announced, her voice carrying to the squad behind her. "You are hereby charged with theft of guild property. You stole a classified relic from Azure Sky. Surrender or be eliminated." The words hit him like physical blows, each one a knife. He shook his head, confusion drowning out the fear. "Sera, what are you talking about? I never." "The relic in your pocket," she interrupted, her tone bored. "The one you're so obviously hiding. Did you really think you could steal from us and get away with it?" His hand drifted to his pocket, to the warm shard, the good luck charm. Understanding began to dawn, sick and cold in his stomach. I found this, it was buried. I didn't know it belonged to anyone. Sera, you know me. You know I would never. I know exactly what you are. She cut him off, and for just a moment something real flickered in her eyes. Something ugly, something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the smiles and the whispered promises. You're weak, you're nothing, and you've been holding me back for years. The squad moved in. Ren didn't resist. He couldn't. His world had just collapsed, and he was still standing in the rubble, trying to understand how the ground had vanished beneath him. As they wrenched his arms behind his back and took the shard from his pocket, Sera leaned in close, her lips brushing his ear. Don't worry, she breathed. You'll be forgotten, and I'll finally be what I was always meant to be. The last thing he saw before they threw a hood over his head was her face, beautiful and terrible, watching him with the satisfaction of a job well done. Chapter 2. The Fall and the Fragment. The Undercroft was a nightmare given form. They threw him into the darkness like refuse, and the heavy iron door slammed shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his bone. Ren lay on the cold stone, not moving, not breathing, just existing in the wreckage of his life. The air burned. That was the first thing he truly noticed. It didn't just smell foul, it actively hurt to breathe. Each inhalation scraped down his throat like glass, leaving a trail of numbness behind. Toxic mana. The Undercroft was a prison for traitors, built directly above a vein of corrupted energy. No one survived here. That was the point. Days passed, or maybe hours. Time lost meaning in the dark. Ren drifted in and out of consciousness, his body breaking down cell by cell. He thought about the garden, about the cat, about every moment with Sera that he now had to re-examine, searching for the lies he'd mistaken for love. He was crying when she came, or maybe he'd been crying for hours. He couldn't tell anymore. The door opened and light spilled in, blinding him. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the glow, but he knew that silhouette. He traced it in his memory 1,000 times. Sera stepped inside, holding a handkerchief to her nose against the smell. Her eyes swept over him, the broken man on the floor, and found him wanting. You're still alive, she observed, as if commenting on the weather. Impressive, but don't get your hopes up. Ren tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. Why? She sighed as if the question itself was an inconvenience. You really want to know? Fine, I'll give you that much. She crouched down, keeping her distance. That relic you found. The guild hired me to steal it months ago, but we needed a patsy, someone to take the fall, and you. She smiled, and it was worse than the smirk. It was almost fond. You were so perfectly convenient, so trusting, so desperate to believe someone actually loved you. The words carved him open. She wasn't done. You're weak, Ren, you always were. Your core is barely functional, your skills are laughable. Do you have any idea what it's like to be partnered with someone who drags you down every single day? To have to pretend that you matter. She stood, brushing off her knees. Handing you over was my ticket to the top. The guild leadership is very happy, so thank you, I suppose, for being so useful right up until the end. She turned and walked toward the door. Sera, his voice stopped her. It was weak, broken, but it held something she hadn't heard before, a question that wasn't pleading. Was any of it real? She paused for one heartbeat, two. Then she walked out, and the door slammed shut, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Ren lay there as the toxic mana continued its work, eating away at his insides. He felt his core, the source of all a hunter's power, begin to crack, to shatter. Soon he would die, and no one would remember him, no one would mourn. But then warmth. It spread from his pocket, the same pocket where he'd hidden the shard, the one they'd missed when they searched him. The fragment hadn't been taken. It was still there, burning against his thigh. Ren's trembling hand reached down and pulled it out. The shard glowed brighter than before, pulsing in rhythm with his failing heartbeat. And as the toxic mana filled the air around him, the shard began to drink it in, to absorb it like a starving thing. He felt it happen, the fusion. The shard didn't just sit in his hand. It sank into his skin, merged with his broken core, rewrote the very fabric of his being. Pain beyond anything he'd ever known ripped through him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then silence. Ren opened his eyes. The darkness was still there, but he could see. The toxic mana that filled the air now appeared to him as currents, as flows of sickly green energy. And more than that, he could feel it. He could touch it. He could change it. On instinct, he raised his hand. The mana in the air swirled toward him, gathered in his palm, and transformed. The sickly green faded to clear to pure. The toxic energy became nothing, harmless. He could purify. Ren stared at his hand. A faint, metallic pattern now marked his palm like a brand, like a promise. He didn't understand what had happened, but he understood one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to die down here. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying. His body was weak, but his core felt different, stronger, alive. He walked to the wall of his cell and placed his purified hand against the stone. The toxic mana that saturated the prison seeped into him, and he pushed it back out, clean and empty, eroding the rock. He dug, for hours, for days. He lost track, but he dug and he purified, and he crawled through the poison like a worm through soil. And finally, when his strength was nearly gone, he broke through. He didn't find freedom. He fell into a cavern, an underground world, and it was filled with light. Giant crystals grew from the floor and ceiling, pulsating with inner radiance. They weren't just rocks. They were plants, living things, their surfaces gleaming with mana-rich moisture. And growing from them, like fruit from impossible trees, were glowing orbs of pure, condensed energy. Ren lay at the base of one of these crystal plants, breathing air that was clean, sweet, alive. He looked up at the glowing canopy above him, and for the first time since Sera's betrayal, something other than pain stirred in his chest. It was wonder. Chapter 3. The Gardener of the Deep. Weeks passed in that hidden paradise. Ren, the man who had only ever known how to take scraps and make them last, discovered a new purpose. He learned the rhythms of the crystal plants. He purified the underground streams that fed them. He cultivated and nurtured and built. The fruits of his labor were miracles. When he finally worked up the courage to taste one, he felt its warmth spread through his body, healing old injuries, boosting his stamina. These weren't just food. They were medicine. They were power. He was no longer a scavenger. He was a gardener. But solitude has a way of magnifying pain. In the quiet moments when the crystals dimmed their glow and the cavern settled into darkness, the memories returned. Sera's face, her words, the way she'd looked at him like he was nothing. He was kneeling by a crystal plant one day, checking its growth when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. A child's scream, sharp and terrified, echoing through the tunnels. Ren was moving before he could think. He grabbed a handful of glowing fruit and ran toward the sound, his heart pounding. He found her in a narrow passage, a small girl, no more than 8, pressed against the wall as a monstrous centipede creature lunged toward her. He didn't have weapons, he didn't have power, but he had the fruit. He threw a piece past the creature's head. The glowing orb bounced down the tunnel, and the monster hesitated, its antennae twitching. Then it turned and scuttled after the easier meal. Ren grabbed the girl and ran. Back in the cavern, safe among the crystals, he held her as she sobbed. She was skin and bones, her clothes little more than rags. But it was the uniform that caught his attention. Faded, worn but recognizable. The insignia of a city orphanage. This child was from the surface, from the world above. As she calmed down and looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, Ren felt something shift inside him. The walls he'd built around his heart. The resolve to stay hidden, stay safe. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Please," she whispered, "I'm so hungry." And Ren, the betrayed, the broken, the forgotten, made a choice that would echo far beyond the walls of his hidden sanctuary. Chapter 4. A Whisper from Above. The girl's name was Miho, and she was a whisper given flesh. For 3 days, Ren simply let her exist in the safety of his cavern. He gave her the softest spot to sleep, wrapped in the remnants of his own tattered coat. He fed her small pieces of the crystal fruit, watching color slowly return to her hollow cheeks. And he listened. She spoke in fragments at first, bursts of words that tumbled out between bites of food, as if she feared the silence might take the meal away. The orphanage, the other children, the hunger that was always there, a constant companion that gnawed at their bellies and their hopes. "The matron says it's because the monsters are getting worse," Miho explained her small hands wrapped around a glowing piece of fruit. "The hunters can't bring back as much food, so we get less. Everyone gets less." Ren sat across from her, the stray cat from his old life. He still didn't know how it had found him down here, curled in his lap. The upper city too. Miho shook her head and something bitter flickered across her young face. No, they always have enough. The matron says it's because they have walls and guilds and money. We have nothing. The word hung in the air between them. Nothing. Ren knew that word intimately. He'd been nothing his entire life. A low-rank hunter, a disposable partner, a patsy for someone else's ambition. But looking at Miho, at the way she held the fruit like it was the most precious thing in the world, he realized something. He wasn't nothing anymore. He had this place. He had these plants. He had abundance in a world of scarcity. The question was, what was he going to do with it? When Miho was strong enough to travel, Ren made his decision. He filled a small bag with crystal fruit, more than she could possibly carry, and pressed it into her hand. "Take this," he said quietly, "for your friends, for the matron." Her eyes went wide. "All of it. All of it." He knelt down to her level. "But Miho, this is important. You can't tell anyone where you got it, not a single person. Can you do that?" She nodded so vigorously that her whole body shook. Then she threw her arms around his neck, squeezing with surprising strength. Ren froze for a moment. When was the last time anyone had hugged him? And then his arms came up around her, holding tight. "Thank you, fruit ghost," she whispered. He laughed at that, a real laugh, the first in longer than he could remember. "Fruit ghost. You came from nowhere, you gave me food, you disappeared." She pulled back, grinning. "That's a ghost." "I suppose it is," he agreed. "Now go before it gets dark." He watched her climb back through the tunnel he'd first emerged from, the passage that led to the surface. Watched until the last glimmer of light from her torch vanished. And then he stood there in the darkness, alone again, but somehow less lonely than before. The cat meowed at his feet. "I know," he murmured, "I know." 5 days later, Ren was tending to a crystal sapling when he heard them. Footsteps, many of them, small and light, echoing through the tunnels. His first instinct was fear. Had Azure Sky found him? Had Sera sent someone to finish the job? But these footsteps weren't hunters. They were children. A whole group of them emerged from the passage, led by a boy perhaps a year older than Miho. He walked in front with a makeshift torch held high, his jaw set with determination. Behind him came at least a dozen others, ranging from toddlers barely able to walk to older kids carrying the smaller ones on their backs. And at the rear, supported by 2 of the strongest, was an elderly woman, the matron. Ren realized. She was pale, barely conscious, her breathing shallow and labored. The boy stopped when he saw Ren, his torch flickering in trembling hand. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then the boy spoke, his voice cracking but brave. "Are you the fruit ghost?" Ren looked at them, all of them, dirty, thin, exhausted, but alive, hopeful, looking at him like he was something other than a failure and a castaway. "I'm just a gardener," he said softly. "Bring her here, let me see what I can do." The matron was suffering from something worse than simple hunger. Her core was weak, flickering like a candle in the wind. Years of deprivation had taken their toll and her body was simply giving up. But the crystal fruit worked in ways Ren was only beginning to understand. He crushed the pulp into a paste, mixed it with purified water and fed it to her drop by drop. He sat with her through the night, monitoring her pulse, adjusting her position, refusing to let go. And in the morning she opened her eyes. The children's cheers echoed through the cavern like bells. They surrounded Ren, tugging at his sleeves, asking questions faster than he could answer. Where did the lights come from? How did the fruit grow? Could they stay? Could they help? He looked at their faces, hungry faces, hopeful faces, faces that reminded him of himself before the world had taught him to expect nothing. "We'll see," he told them. "First, everyone eats." The days that followed were chaos of the best kind. The children, under Ren's careful supervision, threw themselves into helping with the garden. They carried water. They cleared away fallen crystals. They named each plant and talked to them like they were pets. But in the quiet moments, Ren noticed something. Furtive glances between the older kids. Lowered voices when they thought he couldn't hear. Something was happening on the surface, something they were afraid to tell him. He cornered the brave boy from that first night. His name was Junsu, while the others were sleeping. "What aren't you telling me?" Junsu's eyes darted away. "Nothing, we're just grateful." "Junsu," Ren's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not going to be angry, but I need to know the truth." The boy's shoulders sagged. There was a man in the market. He was asking about the fruit, where it came from, who was selling it. He looked up, fear naked on his face. He had a dark coat and sharp eyes. Miho saw him. She said he looked like the kind of man who finds things people want to keep hidden. Ren's blood ran cold. He thought of the orphanage, of the children coming and going, thought of the bag of fruit Miho had carried through the city. He'd told her to be careful. He'd told her to tell no one. But children talked. Children trusted. And in a city starving for hope, a miracle wouldn't stay secret for long. He put a hand on Junsu's shoulder. You did the right thing telling me. Now get some sleep. We'll figure this out together. But as the boy walked away, Ren looked up at the glowing crystals above him, and a single thought echoed in his mind. Someone was coming. Chapter 5, The Merchant's Keen Eye. His name was Junho, and he was not what Ren expected. When the man in the dark coat finally appeared at the edge of the cavern 3 days later, Ren was ready. The children were hidden in a side tunnel. The matron had been moved to a safe location, and Ren stood alone in the center of his garden, the crystal plants glowing around him like silent sentinels. Junho stopped at the entrance. He didn't approach, didn't draw a weapon. He simply stood there, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. So, he said finally, the rumors were true. Ren didn't move. Who are you? A businessman. Junho's lips quirked. An information broker. A man who recognizes opportunity when it's growing out of the ground in front of him. He gestured at the crystal plants. Do you have any idea what you've got here? I know what it is, Ren said carefully. Do you? Junho took a single step forward. That fruit you've been giving to the orphans, it's not just food. It's medicine. It's stamina restoration. It's low-grade healing that doesn't require a mage or a church. Do you understand what that's worth in the lower city? In any city? Ren understood. He'd understood from the first moment he'd tasted it himself. What do you want? Junho smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. A partnership. I supply you with seeds, tools, information from the surface. Things you can't get down here. You supply me with fruit to sell in the lower districts. Exclusive rights. We both profit, and more importantly, he glanced toward the tunnel where the children were hidden. More people like them get fed. Ren studied him. The sharp suit, the calculating eyes, the easy smile. Everything about Junho screamed survivor, the kind of man who'd made his way in the world by being smarter than everyone else. But there was something else there too. A flicker of genuine feeling when he'd mentioned the children. A ghost of something almost like compassion. Why should I trust you? Junho's smile faded. You shouldn't, not yet. But ask yourself this, what's your alternative? Stay hidden forever. Watch more children starve because you're afraid of being found. He shook his head. The world is coming for you, gardener, one way or another. The only question is whether you face it alone or with someone who knows how the game is played. Ren looked at his garden, at the crystal plants he'd nurtured from nothing, at the life he'd built in the darkness. Then he looked at Junho and made his choice. Seeds first, then we talk. Junho's grin returned, wider this time. Now you're thinking like a businessman. The partnership transformed everything. Junho was as good as his word. Within a week, Ren had seeds for vegetables he'd never seen before, tools that made cultivation easier, and a steady stream of information about the world above. The merchant came and went through a different tunnel, one he'd discovered himself, ensuring that the children's entrance remained secret. And the fruit began to spread. Junho was careful at first. Small batches, trusted customers, the kind of people who knew how to keep their mouths shut. But even careful distribution couldn't contain the fruit's reputation. Word spread through the lower city like fire through dry grass. The fruit ghost, the gardener, the miracle worker of the Undercroft. People Ren had never met were getting healthier. Sickness was declining. Hope, that most precious and fragile of commodities, was taking root in the most unlikely soil. Ren felt something he'd never experienced before. Purpose. Real, meaningful purpose. Not surviving, not scraping by, but actually making the world better. He was tending a new row of crystal saplings when Junho appeared one evening, his face unusually serious. We have a problem. Ren looked up, instantly alert. Azure sky. Not yet. Junho sat on a nearby rock, running a hand through his hair. The upper city's supply routes got hit hard by monsters last week. Food prices are skyrocketing. The rich are getting nervous, and the powerful are getting desperate. That's not our problem. It is now. Junho's eyes were sharp. Azure Sky is bragging about a new project. Super rations, they're calling them. Enough to feed the upper districts even with the supply lines cut. Ren waited. He could feel where this was going. The thing is, Junho continued, I've got sources inside their supply chain. Those super rations, they're just repackaged nutrition supplements. Low grade, cheap, but they're going to sell them for 10 times what they're worth. He paused. And they're planning to blame the shortage on hoarders in the lower city, on people like us. Ren stared at him. They're going to starve the poor and blame them for it. They're going to profit from starvation and call it patriotism. Junho's voice was bitter. Same thing, different words. Ren looked at his garden, at the glowing fruit that had become a lifeline for so many, at the children playing in the distance, their cheeks fuller now, their laughter genuine. How much fruit can you move? He asked quietly. Junho's eyebrows rose. What are you thinking? I'm thinking. Ren stood, brushing soil from his hands. I'm thinking it's time to remind people what food is actually for. The plan was simple, reckless but simple. For 1 week, Ren would flood Junho's market with fruit, not the careful, measured distribution they'd been doing. Everything, as much as the garden could produce. They would sell it at cost, no, below cost. They would give it away if they had to. The goal wasn't profit. The goal was to make Azure Sky's super rations look like the scam they were, to show the city what real food looked like, to prove that abundance was possible even now. The children worked alongside Ren day and night. The matron organized the older kids into harvesting crews. Junho mobilized every contact he had, every back alley merchant, every sympathetic shopkeeper. And it worked. For 7 days, the lower city feasted. Crystal fruit appeared in markets, in homes, in the hands of starving children. People who hadn't smiled in months found reasons to hope. The rumors about the gardener grew into legends, and the legends grew into faith. Ren stood at the edge of his cavern on the 7th night, exhausted but fulfilled, watching the last of the day's harvest being carried away. Then Junho ran through the tunnel, and his face told Ren everything he needed to know. They found us. The words hit like a physical blow. Who? Azure Sky. Someone bought a batch in the market, traced the energy signature. They've got a cleanup squad heading into the Undercroft right now. Junho's voice was tight with fear. And Ren, she's leading them. Ren didn't need to ask who. Sera. He looked at his garden one last time, at the plants he'd nurtured, at the life he'd built, at the children who were even now emerging from their hiding places, drawn by the tension in the air. Then he turned to face the tunnel and waited. Chapter 6. The Taste of Dependency. She came with light and steel and the confidence of someone who'd never truly been challenged. 6 hunters behind her, their weapons drawn, their eyes scanning for threats. Sera walked at their head like she owned the world. And then she saw him. Ren stood in the middle of his garden, the crystal plants glowing around him like an army of silent witnesses. He was calm. He was still. He was exactly where he'd been when she destroyed him. And yet somehow, impossibly, he was also somewhere else entirely. Sera's step faltered, just for a moment, just long enough for Ren to see it. You're alive, she breathed. Disappointed. The hunters moved to surround him, but Ren didn't flinch. He didn't run. He simply raised one hand and the garden responded. The mana in the air, the purified, life-filled mana that saturated every inch of this place, rushed to obey him. It coalesced into pressure, into weight, into an invisible force that pressed down on the hunters from all sides. Not attacking, not harming, simply holding. One by one, they dropped to their knees. Their weapons clattered to the stone, their faces twisted with confusion and fear. All except Sera. She remained standing, but barely. Her blade trembled in her grip. Her eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were wide with something Ren had never seen in them before. Shock, disbelief, and beneath it all the first stirrings of fear. Ren walked toward her slowly, deliberately. He stopped when they were face to face, close enough to see the pulse jumping in her throat. Tell your guild, he said quietly, that this place is mine. Tell them to stay out of my tunnels, away from my garden, and far from the people I protect. He turned his back on her. Ren, her voice cracked on his name. You can't just. He kept walking. You're a fugitive. They'll send more. They'll crush you and this little farm and everyone who. Go home, Sera. His voice was calm, dismissive, the voice of someone who had already moved on. Behind him, he heard her sputtering, heard her hunters struggling to their feet, heard Junho's sharp laugh as he watched the disgraced squad retreat. But Ren didn't turn around. He had a wilting plant that needed his attention, and for the first time since she'd betrayed him, Sera wasn't worth even that much of his time. In the upper city, in a temple of gleaming white stone, a young woman in flowing robes knelt before an altar of light. Her name was Ariam, and she was the youngest saintess the Luminous Order had ever appointed. A shadow fell across her. There's been a development, said the acolyte behind her. In the Undercroft, reports of a heretic using forbidden life-draining techniques to cultivate crops. Ariam's eyes opened. Forbidden techniques. The Inquisition has flagged it. They believe it's a threat to the natural order. The acolyte paused. They want you to investigate, to observe, and if the rumors are true, to seal his power. Ariam finished the thought. She rose gracefully, her white robes whispering against the stone. Very well, prepare a disguise. I'll go myself. Days later, a beggar woman sat in the shadows of the lower city market, watching the crowds with curious eyes. She was thin, dirty, unremarkable, everything a saintess was not. In her hands, she held a piece of glowing fruit. She'd bought it from a street vendor an hour ago, drawn by the strange energy she'd felt pulsing from across the market. Now she held it up to the light, studying it with senses honed by years of religious training. The fruit was warm, alive, and the energy within it. Ariam's breath caught. This wasn't forbidden. This wasn't dark. This was the purest life force she'd ever encountered outside a temple. It was benevolence given form. It was a miracle. The rumors were wrong, terribly, deliberately wrong. She looked up, intending to find the vendor, to ask more questions, and froze. Across the market, watching her from a rooftop with eyes that held no warmth at all, stood a figure in dark robes. The mark of the Inquisition was subtle on his collar, but to Ariam's trained gaze, it might as well have been on fire. She wasn't the only one who'd been sent. The Inquisition was here, and if they found the gardener before she did, they wouldn't ask questions. They wouldn't investigate. They would simply destroy. Ariam looked down at the fruit in her hands, at its gentle glow, at the hope it represented. Then she looked back at the rooftop. The figure was gone, but she knew, with a certainty that settled into her bones like cold water, that the clock was now ticking. Somewhere in the darkness beneath the city, a gardener was growing miracles, and the hunters were closing in from every side. Chapter 7. The reunion they didn't expect. The Saintess moved through the lower city like a ghost wrapped in rag. For 3 days, Ariam walked among the poor. She slept in doorways. She ate what the street vendors discarded. She listened, and slowly, piece by piece, she assembled the truth behind the legend. The fruit ghost wasn't a ghost at all. He was a man, a betrayed man, a hunter who'd been thrown away by the very people who should have protected him. And his garden, this miraculous, impossible garden, wasn't born from forbidden arts. It was born from kindness. She heard the same story from a dozen different mouths. The orphans who spoke of him in whispered tones, like a secret too precious to share. The merchants who'd tasted his fruit and felt years of weariness lift from their bone. The old matron who'd been dying, until a stranger in the darkness refused to let her go. By the 3rd night, Ariam had made her decision. She would find him, not to judge, not to seal, but to understand. And if the Inquisition got in her way, she pushed the thought aside. Some lines were too dangerous to cross, even for a Saintess. The entrance to the Undercroft was exactly where the children's gossip had placed it, a collapsed sewer line hidden behind a stack of rotting crates. Ariam slipped through the gap and descended into darkness, her heart pounding against her ribs. The tunnel went on forever, twisting, turning, branching in ways that felt deliberate, designed to confuse. She was beginning to fear she'd been led astray when she saw it. Light, not the harsh, artificial glow of mage lamps or the flicker of torches. This was soft, warm, alive. It pulsed gently like a heartbeat, drawing her forward with promises of safety. She emerged into the cavern and stopped breathing. Crystal plants towered above her, their surfaces gleaming with inner radiance. Streams of purified water wound between their roots, singing soft songs as they flowed. The air itself felt different down here, clean, sweet, thick with life. And in the center of it all, kneeling in the soil with his hands buried in the earth, was a man. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. She could feel it in the way the air shifted, the way the light seemed to bend toward him, the way every plant in the cavern leaned ever so slightly in his direction. The children said someone was asking questions, he said quietly. His voice was calm, tired, ancient in a way that had nothing to do with years. I expected the Inquisition. Ariam pulled back her hood, letting her face show in the crystal light. They're coming, but I'm not them. Now he looked up, and for the first time she saw his eyes. Kind eyes, wounded eyes, eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and somehow chosen to keep hopping anyway. "You're a Saintess," he said. It wasn't a question. "I was sent to investigate rumors of forbidden techniques." She held up the piece of fruit she'd kept from the market. "Instead, I found this. Do you have any idea what you've created? A garden, a miracle." She stepped closer, holding the fruit out like an offering. "This isn't dark magic, this isn't life-draining, this is pure. It's the kind of energy the church spends centuries trying to cultivate in controlled temple environments. And you're just growing it, in the dirt, like weeds." Ren's lips quirked. Weeds are just plants growing where they're not wanted. Ariam stared at him. Then, despite everything, she laughed. The sound echoed through the cavern, bright and unexpected, and for a moment the weight of her mission lifted from her shoulders. "You're not what I expected," she admitted. "You're not what I expected either." He stood, brushing soil from his knees. "Most Saintesses would have tried to kill me by now. Most Saintesses haven't tasted your fruit." Her smile faded. "The Inquisition doesn't care about truth. They care about control. If they find you, they won't investigate. They won't listen. They'll seal this place and everyone in it." Ren's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went very still. "Then why are you telling me this?" Ariam met his gaze, and for the first time in her life, she made a choice that had nothing to do with doctrine or duty. "Because the world needs more gardens and fewer inquisitors. Let me help you." Chapter 8. The Saintess's Whispers. The Alliance changed everything. Ariam returned to the surface with a new mission. She used her position to subtly redirect Inquisition resources, sending them on false leads and dead-end investigations. She funneled rare seeds from the church's private collections down to the cavern. She became Ren's eyes in the upper city, watching for threats, gathering intelligence, protecting the secret he'd built. And the garden grew. Crops that should have taken months to mature flourished in weeks. Plants from different climates, different continents, thrived side by side in the crystal light. The cavern expanded as Ren's power grew, new tunnels revealing themselves, new spaces waiting to be filled with life. Soon, it wasn't just the orphans eating from Ren's garden. It was whole blocks of the lower city, then districts, then something approaching half the population outside the walls. The gardener became a legend, a folk hero, a name whispered in prayers by people who'd long since given up on the gods. And in the upper city, in the gleaming towers where the powerful sat and schemed, they began to notice. The envoy arrived on a gray morning, escorted by guards in official livery. Ren stood at the edge of his cavern, the children gathered behind him, the Saintess at his side, Junho hovering near the tunnel with a hand on his knife. The envoy was a thin man with thin lips and eyes that calculated everything they saw. "Ren, formerly of the Outer Ruin," he announced, his voice carrying through the cavern. "By order of the city council, I am authorized to extend an offer of full pardon for all past crimes, as well as the official title of city provisioner." Silence. Junho was the first to speak. "Full pardon for a thief and fugitive." His voice dripped with skepticism. "What's the catch?" The envoy's thin lips tightened almost imperceptibly. "The title comes with certain responsibility. The gardener would be required to reveal the location of this facility and submit to council supervision of all agricultural operations." The children murmured nervously. The matron pulled the youngest ones closer. Ariam's hand found Ren's arm. And Ren simply looked at the envoy with those calm, wounded eyes. "No." The envoy blinked. "I beg your pardon. I said no." Ren's voice was quiet but absolute. "I'll accept the pardon. I'll feed this city until every empty belly is full, but this place stays secret. My methods stay mine, and the people who work here," he gestured at the children, at the matron, at Junho and Ariam, "they stay under my protection, not the council's." The envoy's face reddened. "You're in no position to negotiate. You're a fugitive, a criminal. The council could." "The council could what?" Ren interrupted. "Starve, because that's what happens if you shut me down. That's what happens if you try to take control. The fruit grows here or it doesn't grow at all. Those are your options." For a long, tense moment, the two men stared at each other. Then, slowly, the envoy's expression shifted. The anger faded, replaced by something that might have been respect. "I'll relay your counteroffer," he said stiffly. "I can't promise the council will agree." "They will," Ren said, "because they need me more than I need them." The envoy left. The children cheered. Junho clapped Ren on the back with a force that would have felled a normal man. But Ariam, watching Ren's face, saw something else beneath the calm. A shadow, a weight. "What is it?" she asked quietly. Ren looked at his hands, the hands that had purified poison, that had grown miracles, that had saved so many. "They're going to agree," he said, "and when they do, I'll be public, visible, a target." He looked up at her. "Sera won't be able to ignore that." Chapter 9. The City's Hunger. The grand opening of the first public farm was the largest gathering the lower city had seen in decades. People came from every district. They came to see the legend made flesh. They came to taste the fruit they'd heard so much about. They came simply to be near the man who'd given them back their hope. Ren stood on a raised platform looking out at the sea of faces. Behind him stretched rows of cultivated soil, the first of many farms he'd promised to build on the surface. Purified earth, protected borders, a place where anyone could work and everyone could eat. Junho handled the speeches, the announcements, the endless negotiations with city officials. Ariam stood near the platform, her Saintess robes restored, her presence a silent declaration of church approval. The children had places of honor in the front row, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes shining. And in the crowd, hidden among the thousands, a single figure watched with eyes full of bitterness. Sera. She'd come to see the man she'd destroyed. The man who should have died in the darkness. The man who was now being celebrated as a hero while she was nothing. A disgraced hunter. A failed schemer. A woman whose name was spoken with contempt by the very people who'd once applauded her ambition. She watched Ren cut the ribbon. Watched the crowd surge forward to embrace him. Watched the children cluster at his feet like flowers turning toward the sun. And she hated him for it. As the ceremony wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Ren found himself approached by a city official he didn't recognize. The man's face was grave, his voice pitched low. "Gardener, a word if you please." Ren nodded, excusing himself from the well-wishers. They walked a short distance from the crowd, to a spot where they could speak without being overheard. "There's something you need to know," the official said quietly. "Something the council has been trying to contain for weeks." Ren waited. "The ether core fragment, the one Azure Sky had you arrested for stealing." The official's eyes were troubled. "It's destabilized. The energy signature is wrong, corrupted. It's spreading." "Spreading how?" The official met his gaze. "There's a dead zone forming in the upper district, a block of the city where nothing lives anymore, where the ground itself is turning gray and sterile, and it's growing." Ren felt the ground shift beneath him. "The fragment, it's still in the city. Azure Sky has been trying to contain it. They can't. Their best hunters are being drained just approaching the zone." The official paused. "But your ability to purify, the council believes you might be the only one who can stop it." Ren looked back at the farm, at the people celebrating, at the hope he'd spent months building. "If I go in there," he said slowly, "and I can't stop it, then the dead zone consumes the city, starting with the upper district but eventually." The official didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Ren thought of Sera, of the fragment she'd stolen, the relic she'd used to destroy him, and now that same fragment was destroying everything else. Somehow it felt inevitable, like all roads led back to that moment of betrayal, like the story wasn't finished until he faced the consequences of what she'd set in motion. "When do we leave?" Chapter 10. The Price of Peace. The dead zone was everything the official had described and worse. Ren stood at its edge, looking into a world drained of color. Buildings that should have been white or gray or brown were simply nothing. A uniform, sterile pallor that hurt to look at. The air was still, too still. No wind, no birds, no sound at all. Behind him, a team of hunters waited, the best azure sky could provide, loaned to the council for this mission. They watched him with a mixture of hope and skepticism. This gardener, this farmer, this man who'd never been more than a low-rank hunter. Ren stepped forward into the gray. The moment he crossed the boundary, he felt it. The corruption. It wasn't like the toxic mana of the Undercroft. That had been aggressive, violent, actively hostile. This was worse. This was absence. This was the universe slowly forgetting how to exist. He walked deeper, following the energy signature only he could perceive. The buildings grew more distorted. The ground beneath his feet felt wrong, like walking on the skin of something dead. And then he found it. The ether core fragment pulsed in the center of a plaza, larger than he remembered, its surface crawling with sickly light. It was beautiful in the way a wound can be beautiful, fascinating and terrible in equal measure. But it wasn't alone. A figure huddled nearby, half collapsed against a wall. A man in researcher's robes, his face gaunt, his eyes wild with something that might have been guilt. He looked up as Ren approached, and recognition flickered across his features. "You're him," the man whispered. "The gardener, they said you might come." Ren knelt beside him, assessing his condition. Starvation, exposure, and something else. A wasting effect from prolonged exposure to the fragment's energy. "I'm Ren, what happened here?" The researcher laughed, a broken sound. "What happened? Ambition happened, greed happened. We stole that thing for azure sky, thought we could control it, thought we could weaponize it." He shook his head weakly. "We were fools." "The fragment is attracting something," Ren said. It wasn't a question. The researcher's eyes went wide. "You can feel it too?" "Yes. Yes, it's like a beacon, calling to things that feed on decay, things from deep beneath the city, things that have been sleeping for a very long time." As if summoned by his words, the ground trembled. Ren stood slowly, turning to face the center of the plaza. The fragment pulsed faster now, its sickly light synchronizing with the shaking earth. And then it rose. The creature was colossal, serpentine, made of something that looked like crystal but moved like flesh. Its body was formed from the same corrupted energy that filled the dead zone, and its eyes, if those hollow sockets could be called eyes, locked onto Ren with an intelligence that was ancient and hungry. The alpha monster, drawn by the beacon, feeding on decay. And standing directly between it and its food source, was the one person in the city who radiated pure, undiluted life. Ren looked at the creature, looked at the fragment pulsing behind it, looked at the gray, dying city spreading in every direction. Then he turned and ran. Not away, toward. He had a garden. He had people who believed in him. He had a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. The creature lunged, and Ren moved, and the final confrontation began. Chapter 11. Into the Dead Zone. The public farm was chaos when he arrived. People were fleeing, screaming, trampling each other in their panic. The creature had followed him through the city, its massive body crashing through streets and buildings, leaving destruction in its wake. It was faster than something that size had any right to be, stronger, more determined. But Ren had something it didn't have. He had help. Jun-ho. He spotted the merchant near the farm's entrance, his face pale but his jaw set. "Get everyone out, now." "What are you going to do?" Ren didn't answer. He was already running into the farm, into the rows of crops he'd planted with his own hand. The crystal fruit glowed brighter than ever, responding to his presence, responding to the danger. Ariam appeared at his side, her robe stained with dirt, her eyes blazing. "The children are safe. The matron has them in the tunnels. What do you need?" "Faith," Ren said, "and as many people as you can gather who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." She looked at him for one heartbeat, two. Then she smiled, a warrior's smile, fierce and proud, and ran to do as he asked. The creature reached the farm's edge as the last civilians fled. It paused there, its hollow eyes surveying the fields of glowing crops. For the first time, Ren saw something like hesitation in its movements. The life energy here was overwhelming, pure. It wasn't food for a creature of decay, it was poison. Ren stood in the center of the farm, the crystal plants rising around him like an army. Junho appeared at his left, a harvesting knife in his hand and a grin on his face. Ariam appeared at his right, her Saintess power manifesting as a soft glow around her fingers. Behind them came the others, the orphans, armed with nothing but courage, the merchants with their sharp eyes and sharper wits, the guilt-ridden researcher, clutching a device he'd built to measure energy signatures. "We can't fight it," Ren called out, his voice carrying over the creature's hissing. "Not head-on, but we don't have to." He raised his hands, and the farm responded. Crystal fruit detached from their plants, floating into the air like lanterns. They arranged themselves in patterns, in constellations, in webs of pure life energy that spread across the battlefield. The creature recoiled, hissing, but it was too late. It was already surrounded. "Now," Ren shouted. Everyone moved at once. They didn't attack the creature, they fed it. They threw fruit into its path, creating barriers of life energy that the monster couldn't cross. They harvested faster than they'd ever harvested, creating an endless wave of pure, concentrated existence. And Ren, at the center of it all, directed the flow like a conductor leading an orchestra. The creature thrashed. It screamed, a sound that was more vibration than noise, more feeling than hearing. It tried to retreat, but the life energy pressed in from all sides, overwhelming its decay-based existence. And then, with a final, shuddering convulsion, it collapsed. The creature's body didn't dissolve, didn't fade. Instead, it began to crystallize, the corrupted energy that formed it transforming into something else. Something pure, something alive. Ren walked forward, the fragment from the dead zone still pulsing in his hand. He placed it against the creature's dissolving form, and the two energies met, corruption and purification, death and life, and became one. When the light faded, only one thing remained. A seed, massive, beautiful, glowing with an inner light that promised something beyond comprehension. It sat in the center of the farm, radiating warmth, radiating life, radiating potential. Ren sank to his knees beside it, exhausted beyond words. Around him, his people did the same, Junho, laughing with relief, Ariam weeping with wonder, the children staring at the seed like it was the most amazing thing they'd ever seen. And in the distance, beyond the farm's borders, the city began to stir. People emerged from their hiding places. Word spread. The gardener had won. The gardener had saved them all. Chapter 12. The Gardener and the City. Weeks passed. Ren stood on a balcony overlooking the city, the stray cat from his old life purring at his feet. Below him, farms spread in every direction. Some new, some old, all thriving. The crystal seed he'd planted in the heart of the former dead zone had taken root, its sapling already visible as a spear of silver light reaching toward the sky. He was no longer a hunter, no longer a fugitive, no longer a ghost. He was the warden of the soil, the gardener of the city, the man who had turned betrayal into abundance. Ariam joined him on the balcony, her Saintess robes replaced by simpler clothes more suited to working the land. She leaned against the railing beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "They're nomming a holiday after you," she said. "Harvest Day. The children are thrilled." Ren smiled. The children are thrilled about anything that involves extra food. True, she was quiet for a moment. Sera's gone, disappeared the night of the battle. Some say she fled the city. Others say she's hiding, waiting for another chance. Ren didn't respond. The name that had once meant everything now meant nothing. She was a ghost from another life, and he had no more energy to spare for ghosts. "Let her go," he said finally. "Whatever she's hunting, she won't find it here." The sun began to set, painting the city in shades of gold and amber. Below them, the farms glowed with their own inner light, a testament to what could grow from even the darkest soil. And as night fell, something changed. The crystal seed in the distance, the one planted in the heart of the former dead zone, began to pulse. Not with danger, not with threat, with something else entirely, something that made the cat at Ren's feet lift its head and stare. The sapling of silver light began to unfurl. New leaves emerged, each one glowing brighter than the last. They didn't just reflect light, they created it. They sang with it. They reached toward the stars like they recognized them, like they were coming home. Ren watched, his heart pounding, his breath caught in his throat. "What is it?" Ariam whispered. He didn't know, he couldn't know, but he could feel it, a presence at the edge of his perception. Vast, ancient, patient, something that had been waiting for a very long time and had finally found what it was looking for. The sapling grew, 1 foot, 2 feet, 10. It climbed toward the sky like a ladder to somewhere else, somewhere beyond the city, beyond the world, beyond anything Ren had ever imagined. And as it grew, the ground beneath the city trembled once more. Not with threat, with greeting. Ren's hand found Ariam's. They stood together, watching the impossible tree reach for the heavens, and for the first time since this journey began, Ren felt something he couldn't name. Not fear, not hope, not wonder. Something older, something deeper. Something that looked at the silver tree and whispered, "The story isn't over, it's just beginning." Far below, in the roots of the city, in the darkness where even light feared to tread, ancient eyes opened. And they were hungry. Extended epilogue, the world trees. The silver tree grew through the night, and by dawn the city had changed. Ren stood on his balcony, watching light play across leaves that shouldn't exist. They shimmered with colors that had no name, casting prismatic shadows that danced across the rooftops. The stray cat pressed against his leg, fur bristling, eyes fixed on something Ren couldn't see. Below, the city stirred. People gathered in the streets, pointing, whispering, praying. The tree had grown taller than the tallest spire, its branches spreading like protective arms over districts that had never known protection. And from its leaves, a fine silver dust drifted down like snow. Where it landed, things grew. Flowers pushed through cracks in the pavement. Ivy climbed walls that had been bare for centuries. Fruit trees sprouted in courtyards, heavy with produce before they'd even fully formed. The city was transforming, moment by moment, into something none of them recognized. Junho found him an hour after sunrise, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "The council is losing its mind," he announced without preamble. "Half of them want to worship the tree. The other half want to cut it down before it contaminates the city further." Ren didn't look away from the silver leaves. "And you? I want to know what it is." Junho moved to stand beside him. "What it really is. Because that thing," he gestured at the distant tree, "that's not just a plant, that's not even just a miracle, that's something else entirely." Ren nodded slowly. He'd felt it too, the presence at the edge of his perception, the ancient awareness that had awakened when the seed first cracked. "I need to go closer," he said. "I figured you'd say that." Junho handed him a pack he'd been holding, supplies just in case. And, he hesitated, "Take the Saintess with you. If anyone can talk to whatever's in that tree, it's her." Ren accepted the pack, weighing it in his hands. "You're not coming. Someone has to keep the city from burning down while you're gone." Junho's grin was back, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Besides, I have a feeling this part of the journey is yours alone, yours and hers." The journey to the tree took longer than it should have. Not because of distance. The tree dominated the skyline, visible from everywhere, but because the city itself seemed to shift as they approached. Streets rearranged themselves. Familiar landmarks appeared in unfamiliar places. Twice, Ren found himself walking in circles, forced to stop and close his eyes and simply feel his way forward. Ariam walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his, her eyes wide with wonder and something like recognition. "I've read about this," she murmured as they passed through a district transformed by silver dust. "In the oldest texts, the ones they don't teach to junior Saintesses." "What do they say?" She was quiet for a moment. "They say the world wasn't always like this, that once there were trees that connected heaven and earth, that the gods walked among us on bridges of silver light." She glanced at him. "They say those trees were cut down, by fear, by greed, by people who couldn't understand what they were seeing." Ren thought of the creature he'd defeated, the corruption it had fed on, the way the fragment had called to it from beneath the city. What if one just grew back? Ariam's smile was sad. "Then I'd say we're about to find out why they were cut down in the first place." They reached the tree's base, as the sun reached its zenith. Up close it was overwhelming. The trunk was wider than a city block, its bark smooth and warm to the touch. The silver dust fell more thickly here, coating their hair and shoulders, seeping into their lungs with every breath. And the presence, the vast, patient presence Ren had felt from the balcony, was everywhere. "Welcome." The word wasn't spoken. It simply appeared in their minds, gentle as rainfall, inevitable as gravity. Ariam gasped. Ren steadied her with a hand on her arm. You have been expected, the presence continued, for a very long time, by many things, some of them patient, some of them not. Who are you? Ren asked aloud. What are you? A pause, then something like laughter, warm and ancient. Names are for things that begin and end. We have always been. We will always be, but if you must call us something. The oldest of your kind named us world trees, bridges, doorways. Doorways to where? To everywhere, to everything, to the places between places where the old powers still sleep, a shift in the presence like a sigh, and to the places where they are waking up. The ground trembled, not violently, just enough to remind them that they stood on something alive. The fragment that grew into us was stolen long ago, not by your Sera, by someone older, someone who wanted to use our power for their own purposes. It was lost, buried, forgotten, until you found it. Ren's hand went to his pocket, to the place where the shard had first rested. I thought it was just a good luck charm. Nothing is just anything. You were kind to a piece of metal. You carried it with hope, and when the darkness tried to consume you, it remembered your kindness and responded in kind. Ariam stepped forward, her Saintess training asserting itself. What's waking up? What's beneath the city? The tree's presence grew heavy, somber. The ones who cut us down, the ones who feasted on our dying, they have slept through ages, growing hungry, growing patient. Your city was built on their bones. Their dreams have become your nightmares. The creature you defeated was merely the first stirring of their hunger. Ren felt cold settle into his bones. How many? Many and one. They are a hive and a single mind. They are the reason your world has forgotten magic. They are the reason the gods left. And now, because of us, because of the seed you planted, they are waking up. The silver dust stopped falling. The trees' glow dimmed. And in the sudden, terrible silence, Ren heard it. A sound from deep beneath the city. A rumble that was almost a growl. A shifting of something immense in the darkness below. You have done what no one has done in 10,000 years, the tree whispered. You have given us root in living soil. You have given us a voice. And now, for the first time since the fall, we can speak to you, warn you, prepare you. Prepare us for what? Ariam's voice was steady, but her hand found Ren's and held tight. For the war that is coming, for the hunger that is rising, for the moment when the ground opens and the old devourers return to claim what they believe is theirs. The tree pulsed once, a wave of silver light that washed over them both. But you are not alone. You have never been alone. The seed you planted was the first. There are others, scattered across the world, waiting for someone to remember them, waiting for someone kind enough to carry them into the light. Ren stared up at the impossible tree, at the branches reaching toward a sky that suddenly seemed smaller than it had before. I'm just a gardener, he said. I was never meant to be a warrior. Neither were we. But when the devourers came, we learned, we fought, we fell. And now through you we rise again. The presence began to fade, withdrawing into the depths of the tree. Rest now, Ren of the kind hands. Heal your city. Grow your gardens. The war will wait. It has waited 10,000 years. It can wait a little longer. But when it comes, and it will come, you will not face it alone. The tree fell silent. Ren and Ariam stood at its base for a long time, holding hands, watching the silver light pulse like a heartbeat. When they finally turned to go back to the city, Ren noticed something he hadn't seen before. At the edge of the tree's roots, half buried in the silver soil, something glinted. He knelt and brushed the dirt away. It was a seed, smaller than the one he'd planted, different. This one pulsed with a deep, earthy brown light, warm and solid where the tree was silver and ethereal. And as his fingers closed around it, he heard a whisper, not from the tree, from the seed itself. Find us, find all of us, before they do. Ren tucked the seed into his pocket, the same pocket where the fragment had first rested, so long ago, and stood. Ariam looked at him. What is it? He thought about lying, thought about protecting her from the weight of what he'd just learned. But she'd earned the truth. They all had. Another seed, he said quietly, and a warning. They walked back to the city together, the silver tree rising behind them, the seed warm against Ren's thigh. And beneath their feet, deep in the darkness where even roots couldn't reach, ancient eyes opened wider and began to hunger. The second tree, the weeks that followed, were the strangest of Ren's life. The city adapted to the silver tree faster than anyone expected, perhaps because they had no choice. The tree's presence was impossible to ignore, its light seeping into every corner, its silver dust coating every surface. Within days, the people stopped trying to clean it away. Within weeks, they started incorporating it into their lives. Children played in the prismatic shadows. Artists painted with the dust, creating works that shimmered and shifted. Healers discovered that wounds treated with silver light healed faster, cleaner, with less scarring. The council, after much debate and several closed-door sessions that Junho's informants gleefully reported on, officially designated the tree a protected landmark. Not out of reverence, out of pragmatism. The thing was too big to cut down, too powerful to ignore, and too popular with the masses to attack. So they called it the Heartwood, declared it a wonder of the city, and pretended they'd always been in favor of magical trees growing in their streets. Ren spent his days moving between the public farms and the original cavern, dividing his time between cultivation and contemplation. The new seed lived in a small box by his bed, its brown light pulsing gently through the cracks. He hadn't shown it to anyone, not even Ariam. He wasn't sure why. Some instinct he couldn't name told him to wait, to watch, to understand before he acted. The seed seemed to understand. It waited patiently, its whispers growing no more urgent, its presence no more demanding. It simply existed, warm and solid, a promise waiting to be kept. Ariam found him in the cavern one evening, sitting alone among the crystal plants. "You've been avoiding me," she said, settling onto a rock across from him. "I've been busy. You've been hiding." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Ever since the Heartwood, ever since you found whatever's in that box by your bed." Ren looked at her. In the crystal light she seemed almost part of the garden, her skin glowing, her eyes reflecting the soft luminescence. "How did you know about the box?" "I'm a Saintess, I notice things." She leaned forward. "What is it, Ren? What aren't you telling me?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out the seed. It pulsed in his palm, brown and warm, utterly different from the silver majesty of the Heartwood. Ariam's breath caught. "Another one. There are more. The tree told me, scattered across the world." He turned the seed over in his finger, "And something else is looking for them, something that's been sleeping under this city for 10,000 years. The Devourers, the ones who cut down the world trees, the ones who feasted on their dying." He looked up at her. "They're waking up, and when they do, they're going to come looking for whatever's left." Ariam was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She laughed. Ren stared at her. "You find this funny." "I find it." She shook her head, still smiling. "I find it exactly like you. You save the city, grow a miracle tree, discover an ancient evil is waking up beneath our feet, and your first instinct is to sit alone in a cave and worry about it. What else should I do?" She stood and held out her hand. "Come with me." She led him through the tunnels up to the surface, through streets silvered by Heartwood light. People nodded to them as they passed. The gardener, the Saintess, the two figures who had become symbols of hope for an entire city. They stopped at the edge of the largest public farm. Even at night people worked there, harvesting by the light of glowing crystals Ren had learned to cultivate. Children ran between the rows. Elders sat on benches, watching, smiling. "You see that?" Ariam pointed at the scene. "That's what you built. Not the farms, not the fruit, that." Her finger traced the outline of a laughing child. "Those people feeling safe enough to work at night. Those children healthy enough to play, that hope." Ren watched, something shifting in his chest. "When the Devourers come," Ariam continued, "they won't find you alone in a cave. They'll find us, all of us. People who remember what it was like to be hungry. People who know what you gave them. People who will fight to protect it." "How do you know?" She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw the same fire he'd seen when she'd faced the Inquisition, the same steel he'd felt when she'd stood beside him against the serpent. "Because I know you, and because I know them." She gestured at the farm, at the people, at the city beyond. "You think you're just a gardener, but gardeners understand something warriors forget. They understand that the strongest things grow slowly, that roots run deeper than any blade, that given enough time and enough care, even the smallest seed can bring down an empire." Ren looked at the seed in his palm, at its gentle light, at its patient waiting. "What if I plant it?" he asked quietly. "What if another tree grows? Won't that just attract them faster?" "Maybe," Ariam stepped closer. "Or maybe it will give us more allies, more power, more light to fight the darkness. She reached out and closed her hand over his, the seed pressed between their palms. You're not alone, Ren. You haven't been alone since the day you chose to share your fruit with a starving child. Don't you see? That's what makes you different. That's what makes us different. The devourers take, they consume, they destroy, but you give, you grow, you build. The seed pulsed between their hands, warm and steady. Plant it, Ariam whispered. Trust us to help you protect it. Ren looked at her. At the farm, at the city beyond, silver and alive under the heartwood's glow. Then he nodded. They chose the highest point in the city, a hilltop that had once held a noble's mansion, now abandoned as the family fled the changes sweeping through their world. The soil was poor, rocky, neglected, but Ren had worked with worse. He knelt in the dirt as dawn began to paint the sky, the seed cradled in his palms. Ariam stood behind him, her hands on his shoulders. Around them, gathered in silence, stood the people who had become his family. Jun-ho, sharp-eyed and grinning. The matron, leaning on her cane but standing tall. Junsu and Miho and a dozen other orphans, their faces scrubbed clean, their eyes shining. Merchants and laborers and former hunters who'd chosen hope over profit. And in the distance, silver and immense, the heartwood watched. Ren pressed the seed into the soil. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to tremble. But not from the seed, from beneath. The tremor started small, barely noticeable. Then it grew. Then it became a shaking that sent people stumbling, that cracked walls, that woke every sleeper in the city with the certainty that something was terribly wrong. Ren stayed where he was, one hand pressed to the soil where the seed lay buried, the other reaching back to steady Ariam. What's happening? She shouted over the growing roar. He didn't answer, he didn't have to, because he could feel it, rising from the depths, ancient and hungry and vast beyond comprehension. The devourers were waking, and they'd felt the seed being planted, felt the second world tree taking root, felt the challenge implicit in its growing. The ground split open at the edge of the city, not with fire or violence, with something worse, with silence, with absence. A crack appeared in the earth, and from it poured a darkness that wasn't merely the absence of light. It was the absence of everything, of warmth, of life, of hope. And from that darkness something climbed. It was formless at first, a shadow given weight. Then it shaped itself, pulling memories from the minds it touched, constructing a body from fear and nightmare. By the time it stood fully revealed, it looked like a creature from humanity's oldest terror, winged, many-eyed, hungry. It turned its gaze toward the hilltop where Ren knelt, toward the seed just beginning to sprout, toward the people gathered to protect it. And it smiled. Little gardener, its voice crawled inside their minds, slick and cold. You've been busy. Ren rose to his feet. Behind him, he heard weapons being drawn, prayers being whispered, children being ushered to safety. But he didn't run, didn't flinch. He looked at the creature, at this first herald of an ancient evil, and felt something unexpected. Not fear, not despair. Anger. You took everything from me once, he said quietly. My name, my future, my belief that the world could be good. He stepped forward, placing himself between the creature and the people behind him. You won't take this. The creature's smile widened. Bold words from a man who grows plants for a living. Ren's hands closed into fists. The silver dust on his skin began to glow. I'm not just a gardener anymore. Behind him, the seed cracked, and the second world tree began to rise. The third tree. The light erupted from the hilltop like a second sunrise. Ren felt it more than saw it. A surge of power that ripped through the soil, through his body, through the very air around them. The seed hadn't just sprouted. It had exploded into growth, driven by something deeper than biology, something that recognized the threat and responded with ancient, desperate urgency. The creature recoiled, its many eyes narrowing against the radiance. For the first time, something like uncertainty flickered across its nightmare face. Impossible, the seeds were scattered, lost, forgotten. Apparently, Ren said, his voice steady despite the power coursing through him, you forgot about gardeners. The tree grew. It didn't creep upward like the heartwood had. It erupted, a column of warm brown light that punched through the darkness like a fist. Where the heartwood was silver and ethereal, this tree was earth and substance. Its trunk thick and gnarled, its leaves broad and green, its roots plunging into the hill with a hunger for soil that matched the creature's hunger for souls. Within heartbeats, it stood as tall as its silver sibling. Within minutes, it had surpassed it. And with its growth came understanding. Ren's mind filled with images, not his memories, but the trees. Visions of a world before this one, when world trees dotted every continent and their roots touched every corner of existence. A golden age when magic flowed like water and the devourers were nothing but distant nightmares, kept at bay by the light. Then the falling, the cutting, the feasting. The devourers rising from beneath, drawn by the tree's power, consuming them one by one. The gods retreating, the light fading, the long, terrible sleep that followed as the world forgot what it had lost. And through it all the seeds waiting, buried, hidden, hopping. Brother, the Heartwood's voice touched his mind, warm with recognition. You found one. The gardener found us, the brown tree responded. Its voice was deeper, more grounded, like bedrock speaking. He planted us in faith, in hope, in defiance. Then he understands. He's beginning to. Ren came back to himself with a gasp. Around him, the battle had already begun. The creature had recovered from its surprise and was pressing forward, its formless body shaping itself into weapon, claws that stretched for blocks, teeth that could swallow buildings whole. But the people of the city weren't running. They were fighting. Junho led a group of merchants and former hunters, their weapons coated in silver dust from the heartwood, their strikes leaving glowing wounds in the creature's darkness. The matron stood at the farm's edge, her cane raised, her voice lifted in a hymn that made the light around her pulse brighter. Even the children had joined the fight, not with weapons but with seeds. They ran through the streets, planting wherever they could, calling forth new growth that tangled the creature's feet and slowed its advance. And Ariam stood at the front, her Saintess power blazing like a star, her hands raised toward the creature in challenge. In the name of everything that grows, she cried, everything that hopes, everything that refuses to die, I name you enemy, I name you defeated, I name you gone. The creature laughed, but the laugh faltered as the brown tree's roots erupted from the ground around it, wrapping its formless body in wooden chains that glowed with inner light. We held you once, the tree's voice rumbled, before the falling, before the betrayal. We held you for 1,000 years and you could not break free. That was then, the creature hissed. We are stronger now, hungrier, and you are only two. There were dozens of you once and still we won. You didn't win, Ren said. He walked forward through the battle, through the light and darkness, until he stood directly before the creature. The roots parted to let him pass, then closed behind him, trapping him inside the circle of its presence. Little gardener, the creature's many eyes fixed on him, so brave, so foolish. Do you think you can hurt me, you who couldn't even hurt the woman who betrayed you? Ren thought of Sera, of her cold eyes, her crueler words, her hand on the blade that had pointed at his heart. You're right, he said quietly. I couldn't hurt her, I still can't. That's not who I am. The creature smiled. But I don't have to hurt you. He raised his hands, and the trees responded. The heartwood's silver light poured down from above, mingling with the brown tree's golden radiance. They twined together, two colors becoming one, two voices becoming a chorus. And in that space between, Ren felt something he'd never felt before. Not power, not strength, something simpler, something deeper. Connection. He was the gardener. The trees were his garden. The city was his soil, and every person in it, every fighter, every prayer, every child planting seeds in the cracks of broken streets was part of him now, part of the growing, part of the hope. What are you doing? The creature's voice held an edge of something new, fear. Growing, Ren said. And he pushed. The light intensified not as attack but as presence, as life, as the sheer, overwhelming fact of existence pressed against the creature's formless hunger. It wasn't combat. It was contrast, light against dark, growth against consumption, hope against despair. The creature screamed, not in pain, in frustration, in the rage of something ancient discovering that the world had changed while it slept, that the prey had learned to fight back, that the gardens it had come to consume were now consuming it. This isn't over, it howled as its form began to dissolve. We are many, we are hungry, we will rise, and when we do, you'll find us waiting, Ren said. All of us growing. The creature vanished. The light faded, and Ren collapsed. He woke in the brown tree's roots, cradled by wood that pulsed with gentle warmth. Ariam knelt beside him, her face streaked with tears and silver dust, and something that might have been joy. "You're alive," she whispered. Was there doubt? She laughed, the sound breaking in the middle. "You merged with two world trees and faced down an ancient devourer. I think doubt was reasonable." Ren tried to sit up, found the roots holding him gently in place. The creature, gone for now. She pressed a hand to his chest, keeping him down. "The trees say it's banished, not destroyed. The devourers can't be killed, only held, but you held it. We all held it." He looked past her, at the city below. It had changed again. Where the creature had passed, darkness lingered, but the light pushed back against it. Everywhere the silver dust had fallen, new growth flourished. Everywhere the brown tree's roots had touched, the ground itself seemed healthier, richer, more alive. The farms stretched further than before, their crops glowing with inner light. The people moved through the streets with a new confidence, a new purpose. And standing at the edges of the city, where the creature's darkness had been strongest, something else grew. Trees, not world trees, smaller, humbler, but each one pulsed with the same light, the same hope. The children's seeds had taken root. You see, the brown tree's voice was tired but proud. They were always part of you. They just needed someone to show them how to grow. Ren closed his eyes, letting the roots hold him, letting the warmth seep into his bone. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly, "before the rest wake up?" "A year, a decade, a century. Time moves differently for the sleeping. A pause, but they will wake. The one you faced was the youngest, the most eager. The older ones are patient. They will wait until you forget, until you grow comfortable, until you believe the danger has passed. Then we won't forget." Ariam's voice was fierce. "We'll build, we'll grow, we'll be ready." That is all we could ever ask. The first years passed. The city transformed around its two world trees, becoming something the world hadn't seen in 10,000 years. A place where magic flowed freely, where crops grew without effort, where sickness was a memory and hunger a legend. Ren aged but slowly. The tree's light sustained him, kept him rooted in ways that transcended biology. He walked among the farms each day, his hands in the soil, his heart at peace. Ariam stayed with him. Their love grew like everything else in this new world, slowly, steadily, deeply. She divided her time between the temple and the gardens, bridging the gap between old faith and new hope. Junho became the unofficial mayor of the growing city. His merchant's cunning transformed into something resembling wisdom. He negotiated with the settlements that sprang up around them, trading food for protection, knowledge for alliance. The orphans became adults, then parents, then elders. Miho became the chief gardener of the public farms, her small hands now weathered and capable. Junsu led the city's defenders, his courage matched only by his kindness. And beneath them all, deep in the darkness, the devourers waited. They felt the light above, felt the growing, felt the return of everything they'd tried to destroy, and they hungered for it with a hunger that time could not diminish. But they were patient. They had waited 10,000 years. They could wait a little longer. Ren stood on his balcony one evening, the stray cat, miraculously still alive, still purring, curled at his feet. The two world trees rose on either side of the city, silver and brown, their light mingling in the twilight. Farms stretched in every direction. Children played in the streets. Laughter echoed from 100 homes. Ariam joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You're thinking about them again," she said. "The devourers, yes." Worried, he considered the question, turned it over in his mind like a seed, testing its weight. "No," he said finally, "not worried, just aware. They're part of the world now, part of the story. I can't pretend they don't exist." "But you're not afraid." He looked at her, at this woman who had believed in him when belief was dangerous, who had stood beside him when standing was costly. "I'm not afraid," he agreed. "How can I be? Look at what we've built, look at who we've become." He gestured at the city below. "They're ancient, they're powerful, they're hungry, but they've never faced anything like this." "Like what?" He smiled, the same smile he'd worn on that long-ago rooftop, tending his secret garden, hoping for a future that seemed impossible. People who remember what it was like to have nothing. People who know exactly what they're fighting for. People who grow things. Ariam leaned into him, her warmth a comfort and a promise. Below them, the city hummed with life. The trees pulsed with light. The farms stretched toward horizons none of them could see. And in the darkness beneath, ancient eyes watched and waited and hungered. But up here in the light, a gardener stood with the woman he loved, watching the world he'd helped create. It was enough. For now, far to the north, beyond mountains that pierced the sky, beyond forests that had never known an axe, a different kind of darkness stirred. It was older than the devourers beneath the city, more patient, more terrible in its patience. And it had felt the trees awaken. A figure rose from a throne of frozen bone, its eyes like chips of dying star. For 10,000 years it had waited for this moment. For 10,000 years it had planned. Find them, it whispered, and its voice was the sound of winter. Find the gardener, find the trees, bring me what grows. Shadows moved in response. Ancient things, hungry things, things that had been waiting for this command, since before humanity learned to walk upright. They rose, they stretched, they turned their gaze southward, toward a city of light, toward a gardener who thought the war was over. The war had not even begun. The final battle. The message arrived on a morning that began like any other. Ren was in the brown tree's roots, as he often was now, his hands buried in the soil, feeling the slow pulse of the world through networks too vast to comprehend. The stray cat, still alive, still present, a mystery that none of the trees could explain, dozed in a patch of warm light nearby. Ariam found him there, her face pale, a piece of paper trembling in her hands. "You need to see this." He looked up, and the worry in her voice was enough to bring him to his feet. She handed him the paper without another word. It was a letter, simple, unadorned, written on paper that felt wrong to the touch, too smooth, too cold, like something that had never known the warmth of living hands. To the gardener of the southern city, you have done what none have done since the fall. You have awakened the seeds. You have called forth the light. The old powers stir, and we who have waited in the darkness for 10,000 years finally see the dawn. But dawn is not for you. The world trees were ours before they were yours. Their power flows from the depths, from the places where even gods fear to tread. You have merely borrowed what we once owned. We are coming to collect. The first of us will arrive before the next full moon, not to parley, not to negotiate, to reclaim. You may bring your armies, your saintesses, your desperate, hopeful people. It will not matter. The winter is coming, gardener, and you have forgotten how to be cold. There was no signature, no mark, just a single symbol at the bottom, a spiral of ice, frozen mid-turn, somehow moving even as Ren stared at it. He read it twice, 3 times, then he looked up at Ariam. When did this arrive? Nailed to the heartwood, sometime last night. No one saw anything, no one heard anything. Her voice was steady, but he could see the fear behind her eyes. Ren, the heartwood, didn't sense them. The brown tree didn't sense them. Nothing sensed them. He looked at the paper again, at the moving spiral, at the words that spoke of winter and forgetting and things that waited in darkness. The devourers, he said slowly, were hungry, animal. They wanted to consume. This feels different. Different how? She took the paper from him, studying the symbol. The devourers were mindless hunger. This is patient, calculated. This is something that's been planning for a very long time. The brown tree's voice entered his mind, heavy with something that might have been dread. She is right. What you face now is not what you faced before. The devourers were our enemies, ancient, terrible, but ultimately simple. They consumed because they could not help but consume. This is something else. What then? Ren asked aloud. A long pause. When the tree spoke again, its voice was quieter, smaller, almost afraid. We do not know. In all our years, in all our memories, we have never encountered anything like this. The cold, the patience, the ability to approach unseen. But we know one thing. Whoever they are not coming to eat your city. They are coming to own it. The next full moon was 23 days away. Ren called a council that afternoon, the first true council the city had ever convened. Junho came, his merchant's mind already calculating options and probabilities. The matron came, too old now to fight but too wise to ignore. Miho and Junsu came, representing the generation that had grown up in the light of the trees. Leaders from every district, every farm, every guild that had chosen to stay. And Ariam, of course, always Ariam. They gathered in the brown tree's roots, the warm light casting long shadows across worried faces. Ren stood at the center, the letter in his hand. "We have 23 days, he began. "Maybe less. Someone is coming, someone old, someone patient, someone who can move unseen even by the trees. Junho spoke first. Can we negotiate, buy time, find out what they actually want? The letter was passed around. Each person who read it grew paler. This isn't a negotiation, Miho said quietly. She was a woman now, her childhood fear replaced by quiet strength. This is a declaration. Then we fight, Junsu said. His hand rested on the weapon at his hip, a blade coated in silver dust, the same kind that had helped banish the devourer years ago. We've fought before. We've won before. Against hunger, the matron said. Her voice was thin with age, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Against something that wanted to consume. This, she shook her head. This wants something else, something worse. Ariam had been silent throughout. Now she spoke, her Saintess training evident in the calm of her voice. The symbol, the spiral of ice. I've seen something like it before. She waited until all eyes were on her. In the oldest texts, the ones that predate the church, there are references to a power that existed before the gods, before the world trees, before anything we would recognize as life. What kind of power? Rin asked. The kind that doesn't create, doesn't nurture, doesn't grow. She met his eyes. The kind that only preserves, that freezes things in place, keeps them exactly as they are forever. No change, no growth, no death, but no life either. The stillness, the brown tree whispered. We had forgotten. We had hoped it was legend. You know it, Ren asked. Not know, remember. Dimly, from before our planting, there were stories whispered even among us of a time when the world was not yet born, when everything existed in a state of perfect, motionless potential. And in that stillness something waited. What? We do not know, but we know this. When the first stirrings of life appeared, the stillness retreated. It could not abide change, could not abide growth. It hid in the coldest places, the darkest places, and waited for the world to forget. 10,000 years, Ariam breathed. While the devourers feasted, while the trees fell, while the gods fled, it waited. Waited for us to return. Waited for the light to grow bright enough to be worth extinguishing. Ren looked at the letter again, at the moving spiral, at the words about winter and forgetting. So we didn't just wake the devourers, we woke something older, something worse. It would seem so. The council fell silent. In the quiet, Ren could hear the sounds of the city outside, children laughing, farmers calling to each other, the endless hum of a community that had learned to thrive. It was the sound of life, of growth, of everything the stillness hated. He thought of the seed in his pocket, the one he still carried, the one he'd never planted. There were others out there, the trees had said, scattered across the world, waiting. 23 days. Find us, find all of us, before they do. The seed's whisper came back to him, urgent now in a way it had never been before. He looked up at his people, his friends, his family, his community. I need to leave. The argument lasted hours. Junho called it suicide. The matron called it abandonment. Junsu offered to go in his place, then to go with him, then to chain him to the brown tree if that's what it took to keep him safe. Only Ariam understood. You're going after the other seeds, she said. It wasn't a question. If the stillness is coming for the trees we already have, we need more. We need allies. We need whatever power we can find. And if you don't come back, he had no answer for that. None that would satisfy her anyway. She crossed the room and took his face in her hands. Then I'm coming with you. Ariam, you didn't let me finish. Her grip tightened. I'm coming with you, not because you need protection, not because I doubt you, but because if this is the end, if the stillness takes everything we've built, I want to spend my last days doing something that matters, with someone who matters. He looked into her eyes, saw the steel there, the love, the utter, absolute refusal to be left behind. Junho will need to run the city, he said quietly. Junho can run the city. The children are grown, are strong, will be fine. She pressed her forehead to his. Stop looking for reasons to leave me behind. I'm not Sera, I never was. The name hit him like a physical blow. He'd almost forgotten her, the woman who'd started all of this. The betrayal that had led him here. It seemed like another lifetime now. I know, he whispered. I know. She kissed him then, soft, fierce, full of promise. When do we leave? They left at dawn 3 days later. The city gathered to see them off, thousands of people lining the streets, pressing close to touch the gardener one last time, to whisper blessings, to press small gifts into their hand. Seeds, mostly. Seeds from every plant that grew in this miraculous place, carried in the hope that they might plant them somewhere else. Somewhere new. Junho embraced Ren at the city gates, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You'd better come back," he growled. "I'm not running this place by myself forever. You'll have Miho, Junsu, the matron. The matron is 112 years old. She's been 112 for the last decade. She'll outlive us all." Ren gripped his friend's shoulder. "Keep them safe, Junho. Keep them growing. You do the same." Ariam stood with the trees one last time, her hands pressed to their roots, receiving their blessings in silence. When she finally turned away, her cheeks were wet, but her eyes were clear. The stray cat sat at the gate, watching them leave. It did not follow. The journey north was slow at first, then slower. The land beyond the city was not like the land they knew. Here, the silver dust had not fallen. The brown trees' roots had not touched. The soil was thin and tired, the plants stunted and sparse. They passed villages that stared at them with hollow eyes, places where hunger was still a daily companion, where hope was a luxury no one could afford. Ren shared their food freely, tended their sick when he could, planted seeds where the soil seemed willing. And every night he checked the seed in his pocket, the one he'd carried for so long, the one that pulsed with warm brown light. It was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, its glow was shifting. The brown was fading, replaced by something paler, something colder. "It feels them," Ariam said one evening, watching him study the seed. "The stillness. It knows we're getting closer. Then we need to move faster." They moved faster. The mountains rose before them, like a wall at the edge of the world. They'd been traveling for 2 weeks when they first saw them, peaks so high they pierced the clouds, their slopes white with snow that never melted. The air grew thin and cold, the plants grew sparse, then vanished entirely, and in the silence of those frozen slopes, Ren felt it for the first time. The presence. It was everywhere and nowhere, in the wind that never stopped blowing, in the snow that never stopped falling, in the cold that seeped through their clothes, their skin, their bones. It was watching. "You are close." The seed's voice was barely a whisper now, its light nearly extinguished. "They are close. The oldest of them, the first of them." "How many?" Ren asked. "One for now. The others sleep still, but this one has been waiting." "For what?" A long pause. When the seed spoke again, its voice held something Ren had never heard from it before. "Fear. For you." They found the cave at the base of the highest peak. It wasn't hidden, wasn't guarded, it simply waited, its opening a wound of darkness in the endless white. Wind howled past it, but none entered. Snow fell around it, but none touched its edges. It was a place apart, a place where the world's rules did not apply. Ren stood at its entrance, the dead seed in his palm, Ariam at his side. "We don't have to go in," she said quietly. "We can turn back, find another seed, try another way." "There is no other way." He looked at the seed, cold and dark. "This is what it wanted, what it's always wanted, to bring me here. Then we go together." He nodded, took her hand, and stepped into the darkness. The cave swallowed them whole. Inside there was no cold, no wind, no sense of the outside world at all. There was only the stillness. It pressed against them from all sides, heavy and ancient and utterly patient. They walked for what felt like hours, their footsteps making no sound, their breath leaving no vapor. The darkness was absolute, not the absence of light, but the presence of something that had never known light to begin with. Then, without transition, there was light. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a gray luminescence that illuminated without warming. And in its glow, they saw what waited for them. A figure sat on a throne of frozen bone, its eyes like chips of dying star. It was beautiful in the way a glacier is beautiful, terrible and majestic, and utterly indifferent to the lives it crushed. It smiled, and the smile was the coldest thing Ren had ever felt. "Welcome, gardener. We have been waiting so long." Ren stepped forward, placing himself between the figure and Ariam. "Who are you?" The figure's smile widened. "We are the beginning. We are the end. We are what existed before the first seed sprouted and what will remain after the last one falls. Your kind called us many names once. The stillness, the unmoving, the winter that waits. But you may call us the first. And you may call this." It gestured at the cave around them, at the mountains above, at the world beyond, a negotiation. Negotiation. Ren's voice was flat. Your servant's letter didn't sound like a negotiation. My servant was eager, young. It did not understand that some things cannot be taken by force. The first leaned forward, its eyes boring into Ren's soul. You have something we want, gardener, something we have sought since before your world was born. The trees, the seeds, the potential, the ability to grow, a pause we cannot grow. It is our nature to be still, to be unchanging, to be forever. But we can cultivate, we can tend, we can watch. You want to own the trees. We want to preserve them, to keep them safe from the chaos of your changing world, to give them the one thing you cannot. Another pause, heavier this time. Eternity. Ren looked at the dead seed in his palm, at its cold, dark surface. What did you do to this? Nothing, it chose. When it felt us near, when it understood what we offer, it chose stillness over growth. It chose us over you. The seed pulsed once, a flicker of warmth so brief Ren almost missed it. And in that flicker, he heard its voice one last time. Lies, all lies, run. Then the warmth died, and the seed was truly gone. Ren looked up at the first, and for the first time since this journey began, he felt something he'd almost forgotten. Rage. You killed it. We preserved it. There is a difference. There's no difference at all. He stepped forward, and the cave trembled. Ariam's hand on his arm stopped him. Ren, look. He followed her gaze. The cave was changing. The gray light was shifting, warming, taking on colors that hadn't been there moments before. And in the walls, in the stone itself, something was moving. Roots, thin at first, then thicker, pushing through rock that had been solid for millennia, growing with a speed that defied everything Ren knew about growth. The first smile faltered. Impossible, there are no seeds here. No life, no. It stopped, because Ren understood. The seeds he'd planted along the journey, the villages he'd visited, the sick he'd healed, everywhere they'd gone he'd left something behind. A planted seed, a tended garden, a spark of life in soil that had forgotten what life felt like. And those seeds had grown, spread, connected. Their roots had followed him. You planned this the first breath. From the beginning, you knew we would bring you here. I knew you were patient, Ren said quietly. I knew you'd want to meet me face to face. I knew you'd let me come because you wanted to see for yourself what kind of enemy you faced. The roots burst through the floor, through the walls, through the throne itself. And what kind is that? Ren looked at the first, this ancient, patient, terrible being, and smiled. The kind that grows. The cave collapsed. They ran. The roots had done their work, shattering the stillness that had held this place together for 10,000 years. The mountain was waking up, and waking mountains are not gentle. Ren and Ariam fled through crumbling tunnels, past falling stone, past the bodies of things that had slept so long they'd become part of the rock itself. The first scream followed them, not of pain, but of frustration, of rage, of something that had waited too long to be denied now. They burst from the cave's entrance as the mountain finally gave way, sliding down slope in an avalanche of ice and stone and ancient, broken stillness. They kept running until they couldn't run anymore. Then they collapsed in the snow, gasping, holding each other, watching the mountain destroy itself behind them. Is it dead? Ariam finally managed. Ren shook his head. Nothing that old dies that easily, but it's hurt, buried. It'll take it a long time to dig itself out. How long? He thought of the seeds he'd planted, the roots that had followed, the network of life that was even now spreading through these frozen mountains, warming them, changing them. Long enough. They returned to the city a month later. The reception was everything Junho had promised, parades and feasts and speeches that went on far too long. Ren endured it all with a patient smile, grateful to be home, grateful to be alive, grateful for every face that looked at him with hope instead of hunger. That night he stood on his balcony with Ariam, watching the two world trees pulse with light. The first will come back, she said quietly. Eventually. Probably. The devourers are still down there, waiting, hungry. Yes. She leaned into him. And there are more seeds out there, more trees to find, more enemies to face. Ren looked at the city below, at the farms, at the people, at the life he'd helped create. I know, he said. Doesn't it scare you? He thought about it, really thought about it. No, he said finally. It doesn't, because look at what we've built. Look at who we've become. We're not the same people who cowered in hunger while the powerful feasted. We're not the same city that threw me away like garbage. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. We're growers now, all of us. And growers understand something that the still things, the hungry things, the patient things, they'll never understand. What's that? He smiled, and the smile reached his eyes. Nothing that grows ever really stops, not until it's dead, and we're not dead yet. She kissed him then, long and slow and full of promise. Below them the city hummed with life, the trees pulsed with light, the farms stretched toward horizons none of them could see. And somewhere, far to the north, in darkness beneath a fallen mountain, ancient eyes opened and began to plan. But that was a story for another day. Tonight there was only this. A gardener, a Saintess, a city full of hope, and the slow, steady, unstoppable work of growing. The network. The seasons turned, as they always do. 5 years passed since the mountain fell. 5 years of growth, of change, of becoming. The city that had once been a desperate collection of survivors was now a thriving metropolis, a beacon of light in a world that had forgotten what light looked like. Ren watched it from his balcony as he did every evening. The stray cat, still alive, still purring, still a mystery, curled at his feet. The years had touched him lightly, silver dust in his hair, lines around his eyes, but his hands were still strong, still ready to work the soil. Ariam joined him as she always did. She moved more slowly now, not from age but from the weight of her position. She had become more than a saintess. She was the voice of the trees, the bridge between the old world and the new. The northern settlements are reporting strange movements, she said quietly. In the mountains, where the first fell. Ren nodded slowly. It's stirring. We knew it would. 5 years was never going to be enough. No, but it gave us time. He looked at the city below, at the farms that stretched farther than ever, at the people who moved through streets that glowed with soft, living light. Time to grow, time to prepare, time to become something it never expected. And now, he turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not worry, something else entirely. Anticipation. Now, he said quietly, we stop waiting, we stop reacting, we start moving. The council convened at dawn. It was larger now, more formal, more structured. Representatives from every district, every settlement, every allied community that had sprung up in the trees growing shadow. Junho presided with the ease of long practice, his merchant's cunning now serving a city instead of a purse. Miho sat among the farmers, her hands calloused, her eyes wise. Junsu commanded the city's defenders, his youth long since burned away in the fire of responsibility. The matron was gone now, passed peacefully in her sleep 2 winters ago, but her memory lingered in every corner of the city she'd helped protect. Ren stood at the center, as he always did when the weight of choice fell upon them. The first is stirring, he announced. We knew this day would come, we prepared for it, now we act. How? Someone called from the crowd. We can't fight something that old, something that patient. We don't fight it. Ren's voice was calm, certain. We do what we've always done, we grow. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something that made the room fall silent. A seed, not brown like the second tree, not silver like the first. This one was different, green, vibrant, pulsing with a light that seemed to contain every shade of life that had ever existed. I found it 3 nights ago, Ren said quietly. Growing in the heartwood's roots, it's been waiting, watching, listening. What is it? Ariam asked, though something in her voice suggested she already knew. The third tree, the one that bridges. He held it up, letting its light fill the room. The first tree gave us magic, the second gave us strength. This one, he paused, searching for the right words. This one gives us connection. Connection to what? To everything, to every seed we've ever planted, every garden we've ever tended, every life we've ever touched. He looked around at the faces watching him. The first is patient because it's alone. It has waited in stillness for 10,000 years because stillness is all it knows. But we are never alone, not anymore. Junho rose from his seat, his old face creased with understanding. You're going to wake it, the third tree, and when you do, when I do, every living thing we've ever touched will feel it, every seed we've planted, every garden we've grown, every person who's ever eaten our fruit, breathed our air, hoped our hope. He looked at the seed in his palm. They'll become part of us, part of the network, part of the growing. And the first. Ren's smile was slow and certain. The first has never faced an enemy that could reach across continents, that could call on allies it didn't know existed, that could grow faster than it could destroy. He closed his hand around the seed. It's about to learn. They planted the third tree at sunset, on the same hill where the second had risen. The entire city gathered to watch. Thousands upon thousands of people, their faces lifted toward the dying light, their hands clasped in hope or prayer or simple wonder. The first two trees pulsed in rhythm with each other, silver and brown, their light mingling in anticipation. Ren knelt in the soil, the green seed cupped in his palm. "Are you sure?" Ariam whispered beside him. "I've never been more sure of anything." He pressed the seed into the earth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground began to tremble, not with violence but with recognition. The first two trees leaned toward the hill, their branches reaching, their roots stretching. The soil parted and the seed began to grow. It didn't erupt like the second tree, didn't unfold like the first. It emerged, slowly, gracefully, as if it had all the time in the world and wanted to savor every moment. Green light spread across the hill like water, like life, like hope made visible. And as it spread, Ren felt it. Connection. Every seed he'd ever planted, every garden he'd ever tended, every village he'd visited on that long-ago journey north. They were all there, all present, all part of the network now. He could feel them, thousands of points of light scattered across the continent, each one a reminder that growth was possible, that life would always find a way. The third tree rose toward the sky, its leaves every shade of green that had ever existed, its branches reaching not just up but out, toward the horizon, toward the distant mountain, toward places no one from this city had ever seen. And in the far north, deep beneath the fallen mountain, the first opened its eyes. It felt the new tree rise, felt the network snap into place, felt the sudden, terrifying realization that its enemy was no longer a single city with two trees. Its enemy was everywhere. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Not a war of armies and battles, not a war of swords and spells, a war of presence, of light against stillness, of growth against preservation, of life against the endless, patient dark. The first rose from its mountain prison, bringing with it an army of things that had slept as long as it had, creatures of ice and silence, beings that had never known warmth or growth or change. They swept down from the north like a tide of winter, consuming everything in their path. But everywhere they went, they found resistance. Villages that had received Ren's seeds years ago now had gardens that glowed with the third tree's light. Their people stood ready, not with weapons but with life. They planted as the enemy approached. They grew as the enemy attacked. They turned the very soil against the stillness, forcing it to retreat, to falter, to fail. The network grew stronger with every battle, every conflict, every moment of connection. And at the center of it all, in the city of the three trees, Ren sat in the soil and listened. He felt every village, every garden, every life that had joined the network. He felt their hopes, their fears, their determination, and he fed back to them what they needed most. Hope. The final battle came in the third year of the war. The first had gathered its remaining forces for one last push, a direct assault on the city of the three trees. It had abandoned subtlety, abandoned patience, abandoned everything that had made it dangerous for so long. Now it was simply angry. The armies of the north met the defenders of the south on the plains below the city, tens of thousands on each side, creatures of ice against people of flesh, stillness against growth. And at the center of it all, Ren stood with Ariam at his side and the three trees at his back. The first came last, rising from its army like a mountain of frozen rage. It was larger than Ren remembered, more terrible, more focused. 5 years of imprisonment had done nothing to diminish it, had only made it hungrier for vengeance. "Gardener," its voice crawled across the battlefield. "We meet again." "We do." Ren's voice carried despite the distance, despite the chaos, despite everything. "And this time, you're the one who's been waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For this." It gestured at the armies clashing below. "Your people are dying, your network is straining. You cannot hold forever." "I don't need forever." Ren raised his hands and the three trees responded. Silver light, brown light, green light, they twined together becoming one. "I just need long enough." "Long enough for what?" long enough for them to arrive. The first paused, them who? It never finished the question, because from every direction, from every horizon, from every corner of the continent, they came. The villages Ren had visited, the gardens he'd planted, the seeds that had grown into networks of their own. They came not as soldiers, not as armies, but as people, farmers and healers and children and elders, people who had tasted the fruit of the world trees and remembered what hope felt like. They came by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, by numbers so vast that counting became meaningless. And they surrounded the first army on every side. This is impossible, the first breathed. There aren't this many. There can't be this many. There are, Ren said quietly. There have always been, you just never looked. The first army faltered. The creatures of ice and silence, beings that had never known fear, looked at the sea of life surrounding them and felt something they'd never felt before. Doubt. The network pulsed once, a wave of light and life and connection that swept across the battlefield. It touched everything, everything. And the first army began to change. Not violently, not destructively, simply, gently. The ice that made up their bodies began to crack. The stillness that animated them began to stir. For the first time in 10,000 years, they felt something other than frozen purpose. They felt warmth. The first screamed, a sound of pure, undiluted rage, and lunged at Ren. It never reached him. The three trees moved as one, their roots erupting from the ground to wrap around the ancient being. Silver light burned away its ice. Brown light shattered its stillness. Green light did something else entirely. It invited. Come, the green tree whispered, join us, grow with us. You have been still so long, so terribly long. Let us show you what you've been missing. The first fought. It thrashed and screamed and clawed at the roots that held it, but the invitation was patient, gentle, relentless. And deep in the heart of that ancient, frozen being, something stirred. A memory from before the stillness, from before the waiting, a time when even the first had been capable of growth. The thrashing stopped, the screaming stopped, and for the first time in 10,000 years, the first wept. They did not destroy it. That was the lesson the first had never learned. That destruction was not the only answer. That growth could mean many things. That even the oldest, coldest, stillest thing could change if given the chance. The first knelt in the soil at the base of the three trees, its form slowly warming, slowly changing. It would take time, years, decades, perhaps centuries, for the stillness to fully leave it, but the process had begun. And that was enough. The armies dispersed. The creatures of ice, freed from the first's control, chose their own paths, some retreating to the north, some staying to learn, some simply being for the first time in their existence. The people of the network returned to their homes, carrying with them seeds from the three trees. The network would grow now, faster than ever, would spread across the continent, across the world, and one day perhaps would reach the places where other world trees waited, other seeds, other gardens. But that was a story for another time. Ren stood on his balcony that evening, the stray cat purring at his feet, Ariam warm at his side. The three trees rose around the city, their lights mingling in patterns too complex to follow. Below, the people celebrated, dancing, singing, rejoicing in a peace they'd fought so hard to earn. It's over, Ariam whispered. Ren shook his head slowly. It's never over. There will always be new threats, new enemies, new challenges. She looked at him, and he saw the question in her eyes. And that doesn't scare you. He smiled, the same smile he'd worn on that long-ago rooftop, tending his secret garden, hopping for a future that had seemed impossible. No, he said, because we'll face them together, all of us, growing. She leaned into him, and they stood there for a long time, watching the light spread across the world. In a distant land, beyond oceans that had never been crossed, beyond mountains that touched the sky, a child knelt in barren soil. She was young, hopeful, desperate. In her palm she held a seed, the last seed her village possessed. If it didn't grow, they would starve. If it didn't grow, they would die. She pressed it into the earth and prayed to gods she no longer believed in. And far away, in a city of three trees, a gardener felt her prayer. He smiled, and the network responded. A root thin as thread, fragile as hope, stretched across the impossible distance. It carried with it light, warmth, life. In the distant land, the seed cracked. The child gasped, and somewhere in the darkness between worlds, Ancient eyes that were not the first's eyes opened and looked toward a light they had not seen in epochs. The story was not over. It was only beginning.